did you know I thought this game came out in 2002 on Game Boy Advance? Yeah, that's right. Weird, ain't it? My introduction to the Zelda series was actually with Ocarina of Time, surprise surprise, despite playing the Super Nintendo fairly regularly as a kid. Saw a neighbor of my grandparents playing Jabu Jabu Spelly and just knew I needed in on the series. From there, I went on to play Oracle of Seasons, Oracle of Ages, and Link's Awakening, all before I even heard of Link to the Past. I actually got as far as Ganon's Tower before quitting, strangely, so it looks like this will be another first for the channel where I beat a Zelda game I never finished before, and it'll probably stay that way unless I'm dragged kicking and screaming back into Zelda 2. Maybe someday. Personal history aside, you guys want to know what I think about the game, right? Well, in truth, despite having played it before and the game inspired by it, Link Between Worlds, I never actually saw the appeal of Link to the Past. It was a fine-looking game, to be sure, and like I said, I was nearing the endgame upon quitting. But the game just lacked the same visual personality that I'd come to expect in the series at that point, from what I had played. And honestly, I can't say my opinion has changed much. A lot of care went into the sprite work, I can tell, but despite how lovingly crafted they are, it was a tad misdirected. Zelda 1 and 2, and Link to the Past, all lack a distinct visual identity. Most of the sprite work simply exists so that you can grasp what you're looking at and little more. Like I said, lacking personality. That's not a bad thing, per se, and I think the rest of the game more than makes up for it, but I thought I'd get that out of the way. Honestly, coming off the back of Zelda's 1 and 2, I was a bit awestruck by how good the gameplay felt by comparison. It was evidently a huge leap for the series. For those that played it at the time when it came out, I can certainly see why it's adored by so many. Everything is improved. World building, characters, sprite work, music, dungeon, boss design, enemies, world layout. I'd argue it was a more revolutionary leap for its respective franchise than the likes of Super Metroid and Super Mario World. Story is still bog standard, so I won't repeat myself, but there is one new addition they added that would become a staple of Zelda storytelling: proving your worth. In the case of Link to the Past, the storytelling device manifests as the medallions of courage, wisdom, and power, which are required to draw the Master Sword. And for comparison's sake, the equivalent would be the spiritual stones in Ocarina, and the pearls of Wind Waker, etc. The completion of said task is when the story and gameplay kick into high gear, and for Link to the Past, that means entering the Dark World, thus increasing the difficulty, and adding another 8 dungeons. But we'll get back to dungeons and overworlds. But for now, let's talk about gameplay. As I mentioned, Link to the Past marks a huge leap for the series in terms of gameplay. Perhaps in part due to the nature of it being a top-down exploration game, these changes are a lot more noticeable than the changes made to the aforementioned Marios and Metroids, which had minor tweaks at best that no less improved the game feel. The most notable change for many going into Link to the Past is the ability to move freely in 8 directions. If you've not been paying attention, Zelda 1 limited you to 4-directional movement, while Zelda 2 split exploration between 4-directional movement in the overworld and side-scrolling for everything else. And for an action-adventure exploration-based game, those can feel rather limiting. Now, let me be abundantly clear. 4-directional and grid-based movement exploration in games isn't bad. It depends on the context surrounding. Pokemon, for instance, has a grid-based format for exploration, and it doesn't interfere with the sense of exploration because your primary means of engaging with wildlife is through turn-based battles. Zelda, on the other hand, is real-time action, so the ability to move in 8 directions is important in making the player feel more versatile. 4-directional movement can work for action as well, certainly, but the game has to be built around it. And in my opinion, Zelda 1 didn't capitalize on it as well as it possibly could have, understandably. So this move to free-range movement was a smart one. Additionally, Link now sports a swing arc during combat. Doesn't sound like a lot, but along with refined enemy design, it goes a long way in making the combat less clunky. Flanking is significantly easier now since enemies can get hit from the side. Additionally, enemies have been built around this. You remember me mentioning how Dark Nuts were arbitrarily invulnerable from the front in Zelda 1, right? Well, now it's clearly projected. Enemies that guard the front aren't immune to damage, and the point they guard with, be it a sword or polearm, is also their means of attack. So combat becomes a dance of evading the lengthy weapon hitbox and closing in on the unprotected areas. Combat can, of course, be made easier with the implementation of items from dungeons and equipment upgrades. I won't be dwelling on items this time, though, but suffice it to say they built upon the base set by Zelda 1. Many items returning, The magic rod has now been split into the ice and fire rods, and the stepladder has been replaced by the far more enjoyable hookshot, which is otherwise functionally similar to the coexistent boomerang. There are also 3 flavors of AoE, and that's about all we've got for noteworthy item-related stuff. They importantly avoid being overly gimmicky. Most of them are practical outside of the area they're obtained, and that's important. I think the most interesting thing for me regarding combat design is how many of the bosses aren't designed with a particular weakness, or if they are, they're not exclusively designed to be fought with the item of their respective dungeon. Hell, some of them even require you explore beyond the dungeon, uncovering secrets to find an item to reveal their weak point. Whether or not that's a better design philosophy than designing a boss around the dungeon item is largely subjective. I'm personally of the mind that as long as it's fun, it doesn't matter. There are arguments for either, though. The Link to the Past approach encourages exploration on part of the player and tests your ingenuity in combat, while dungeon item-based bosses can ensure that you properly understand the item and test what you learn from exploring the dungeon itself. Though in Links to the Past case, some dungeon items are just equipment upgrades, so skill-focused bosses makes a bit more sense here. Overall design has significantly improved on what was established in Zelda 1. You've got a map that actually displays landmarks rather than a simple grid, and the world itself features said landmarks in meaningful ways, so every screen of the game feels distinct from one another, avoiding the homogeneous design of Zelda 1. Overall, the world design is very strong. There's a variety of biomes, tons of secrets to uncover, and the game even carries over the town aspect from Zelda 2, with far more success. Kakariko is a beloved village of the Zelda series, and with good reason. It's got a lot more care put into its layout and design than the likes of whatever the towns were in Zelda 2, all of which were flat with occasionally different textures. They even took the time to make every character distinct from one another in Link to the Past, which is a lovely attention to detail. It almost makes me regret slagging off the game for lack of solid art direction earlier. Almost. Dungeons are great as well. Every dungeon feels distinct from one another, an aspect achieved by Zelda 1 as well, but used to much greater effect here. You've got your standard dungeons, certainly. You've got ascents up towers, weaving in and out of the ground through a skull-littered forest, breaking into a thieves' hideout, and much, much more. More importantly, Link to the Past brought puzzles into the mix beyond simple navigation through combat gauntlets, though there's certainly still plenty of that. Yes, each level has a gimmick, and I think for the most part they're handled well. The standout one to me is the thieves' hideout, simply on the grounds that you're required to use the environment to trigger the boss fight other than simply walking into a room. It was an immediate hook that sucked me into the fight, though the fight itself was hurt a bit by the Wii U's built-in emulator lagging at the number of projectiles on screen at once. Got me killed a few times, but that's not the game's fault, assuming that wasn't a problem in the original Super Nintendo version, of course. Yes, the game is good. Great even, and if you haven't played it, you should go fix that. It, much like its predecessors, can certainly be obtuse at times, but you're given enough direction that a guide shouldn't be needed. I enjoyed the heck out of it, and you should too. Next time we'll be tackling Link's Awakening for Game Boy Color. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to like and subscribe, and hit the bell icon because YouTube is run by a bunch of bell-ins who don't know what a fucking subscription means. Salt aside, I hope you all have a fantastic night and that this video lit a fire under you.